In 1875, a geologist named Henry Newton stood at the base of a massive column of rock rising from the Wyoming plains and wrote in his field notes that he could not fully explain what he was looking at. Not the composition. Not the height. Not the symmetry. What he couldn't explain was the pattern on its surface. Hundreds of vertical columns, almost perfectly hexagonal, running from the base to the summit in near-flawless geometric order. As if something had pressed a template into stone. As if something had imposed structure onto raw earth with a precision that erosion alone could not account for. The official explanation that followed was clean, simple, and widely accepted. Volcanic intrusion. Cooling magma. Natural columnar jointing. And for over a century, that explanation has held. But here is what the explanation does not address. Devil's Tower is not alone. Across 6 continents, on every major landmass on this planet, the same structure repeats. The same flat-topped summits. The same geometric columns. The same sheared horizontal surfaces rising from surrounding terrain in ways that defy the gradual processes of natural erosion. The same absence of debris fields large enough to account for what appears to be missing mass. Each one has been explained individually. None of them have ever been fully explained together. That is where this investigation begins. Let's establish what we're looking at before we go any further. Devil's Tower, Wyoming. 1,267 feet above the surrounding Belle Fourche River Valley. 867 feet of sheer vertical rise from its base. A summit that is almost perfectly flat, roughly the size of a football field, sitting atop a column of phonolite porphyry that geologists classify as igneous rock formed from slowly cooling magma. The columns that cover its surface range from 6 to 8 feet in diameter. They are not random. They are not approximate. They are strikingly, almost disturbingly, uniform. The official geological explanation is called columnar jointing, a well-documented process in which cooling lava contracts and fractures in repeating polygonal patterns. Basalt columns form this way. The Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland formed this way. Fingal's Cave in Scotland. The columns of Devil's Postpile in California. These are all real formations. The process is real. The science is sound. But the science of columnar jointing describes how columns form on their surface. It does not explain the sheared, flattened summit. It does not explain why the surrounding rock that once presumably surrounded this structure, the sedimentary material that geologists say once embedded this formation, has been stripped away so completely and so cleanly that the tower now rises as a solitary monolith with no significant talus field proportional to the scale of what is missing. There should be more rock at the bottom. Substantially more. And then you look at the other towers. Mount Roraima. Southwestern Venezuela, on the border of Brazil and Guyana. A tepuis, a table mountain rising 9,219 feet above sea level, with vertical cliffs on every side and a flat summit plateau of approximately 12 square miles. The Oyen tepuis. The same region. Nearly 700 square miles of flat-topped summit surrounded by sheer cliff walls dropping thousands of feet. The Zhangjiajie sandstone pillars in Hunan Province, China. Hundreds of them. Columns rising from a forested valley floor, their tops flattened, their sides almost perfectly vertical, distributed across the landscape in a pattern so striking that filmmakers used them as the visual reference for floating mountains. The Bungle Bungle Range in Western Australia. Beehive-shaped domes of sandstone, striped in orange and black, their upper surfaces flattened or rounded in ways that seem inconsistent with the surrounding erosional landscape. Mount Erebus in Antarctica. Flat-topped volcanic islands off the coast of Iceland. The mesa formations of the American Southwest Monument Valley, canyonlands, the Vermilion Cliffs, hundreds of flat-topped buttes and mesas rising from eroded plains with vertical sidewalls and horizontal crowns. And the towers. Everywhere. The towers. Not volcanic plugs in the traditional sense. Not simple erosional remnants. But vertical, column-bearing, flat-topped structures distributed across continents and geological zones with a frequency that, when mapped, begins to suggest something more systematic than coincidence. The question is not whether the individual explanations are valid. The question is whether the individual explanations are complete. Let's talk about what the establishment explanation requires you to accept. Columnar jointing, as a process, is thoroughly understood. When lava or magma cools, it contracts. As it contracts, it fractures. Because the thermal stress distributes relatively evenly across a cooling surface, the fracture network tends toward hexagonal geometry, the most efficient way for a plane to crack under uniform stress. This produces the distinctive columns we see at Devil's Tower, at the Giant's Causeway, at Svartafoss in Iceland, at the Organ Pipes in Victoria, Australia. This is not disputed. What is disputed not loudly, not in mainstream journals, but in the margins of geological literature and in the field notes of researchers who have spent time at these sites, is the summit question. For Devil's Tower specifically, the accepted model proposes that the tower is the remnant of a volcanic intrusion magma that pushed up through sedimentary layers and solidified underground, then was gradually exposed as the surrounding softer rock eroded away over tens of millions of years. This model requires that the original sedimentary rock surrounding the tower eroded completely. It requires that the erosional products, the material that once encased this structure, was carried away by river systems and wind over geological time. And geologists will point to the Belle Fourche River as the agent of this removal. But there is a problem with the volume. The estimated volume of material that would need to have been removed to expose Devil's Tower in its current form, the surrounding rock envelope that once embedded this intrusion, runs into the hundreds of cubic miles of material. The Belle Fourche River is not a major river. It is not the Colorado. It is not the Missouri. It is a tributary system operating in a relatively dry climate. The math of sediment transport, applied honestly to this site, creates what geologists privately acknowledge as a timing problem. How do you remove that much material that quickly, geologically speaking, and leave a summit so clean, so flat, so unweathered at its crown, that it still stands at near-perfect horizontal geometry? The Native American traditions surrounding Devil's Tower are significant. Multiple indigenous nations, the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Kiowa, the Crow, have independent origin traditions connected to this formation. Many of these traditions share a structural similarity: the tower rose from the ground, or was elevated, at a specific moment. A moment of change. A moment of rupture. The Lakota call it Mato Tipola, Bear Lodge. The Cheyenne call it Bear's Teepee. The Kiowa oral tradition describes the formation as rising suddenly to protect children being pursued by bears, the scratch marks left by the bear's claws forming the columns on its surface. These are treated, in mainstream discourse, as mythology. But here is a pattern worth noting. Across the world, flat-topped formations and tower formations carry origin stories that describe sudden emergence, sudden elevation, or catastrophic change. The tepuis of South America are considered the dwelling places of gods and spirits in the traditions of the Pemen people, ancient, elevated, apart from the ordinary world. The sandstone pillars of Zhangjiajie appear in Chinese literary and spiritual traditions as axis mundi symbols, pillars connecting earth to heaven. The flat-topped mountains of Ethiopia, the ambas, appear repeatedly in religious and dynastic history as places of sudden sacred significance. These are not geological textbooks. They are cultural memory. And cultural memory, when it converges across unconnected civilizations on the same structural theme, deserves something more than dismissal. The question worth asking is, what if some of these traditions are describing something that happened within human memory? Not millions of years ago. Not in deep geological time. But within the span of recorded or pre-recorded human experience. The Deccan Traps of India. This is where the conversation becomes genuinely uncomfortable for the conventional model. The Deccan Traps are one of the largest volcanic features on Earth, a vast plateau of flood basalt covering roughly 200,000 square miles of the Indian subcontinent. The lava flows that created them were deposited approximately 66 million years ago, which is, notably, the same period as the Chicxulub impact event and the mass extinction that ended the age of non-avian dinosaurs. The traps are not columns. They are plateaus. But within and around the Deccan Traps, you find something notable: steppe basalt formations, flat-topped hills with columnar structures, and in some areas, formations that bear a striking resemblance to much smaller versions of the column-bearing towers found in other parts of the world. The pattern of flood basalt events globally is extraordinary in its scale. The Columbia River basalts in the American Northwest. The Siberian Traps. The Parana and Itendika Traps spanning South America and Africa. The Karoo Traps of Southern Africa. The Ethiopian Traps. Each of these represents a catastrophic outpouring of lava that reshaped entire continental surfaces. Each of them left behind flat, horizontal basalt plateaus of immense extent. And in each of these regions, you find the same repeating architectural detail: flat-topped formations, columnar structures, sheared summits, and tower-like remnants. Now here is what the conventional model says: flood basalts and columnar jointing are the inevitable result of large-scale magmatic events. The columns form as the lava cools. The flat tops are the remnant surfaces of original lava flows. The towers that remain are erosional survivors, the harder rock that outlasted the softer material around it. This is internally consistent. But it does not explain the global simultaneity question. Multiple major flood basalt events cluster in time around known extinction boundaries and known periods of dramatic global change. The Siberian Traps align with the Permian-Triassic extinction, the worst extinction event in Earth's history. The Deccan Traps align with the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary. The Columbia River basalts deposited during the Miocene, a period of significant faunal and climatic disruption. The mainstream interpretation treats these as coincidences of timing, or as geological events that triggered the extinctions through atmospheric and climatic effects. But a different framework, one that several non-mainstream researchers have developed at the margins of accepted geology, suggests something more systemic. What if flood basalt events, and the tower formations they leave behind, are not causes, but consequences? Consequences of something that struck the Earth from outside. Something that delivered energy to the surface on a scale sufficient to destabilize magmatic systems, fracture surface rock, and produce the kind of catastrophic reshaping that would look, millions of years later, like natural geological process. Mainstream geology acknowledges impact events. It acknowledges that asteroid strikes can trigger volcanic activity. The Chicxulub impact and the Deccan Traps temporal correlation is openly discussed in peer-reviewed literature, not as settled fact, but as a legitimate scientific question. What mainstream geology does not discuss openly is what a near-global impact or impact-related event, a comet breakup, a bombardment sequence, a massive atmospheric pressure event would look like in the geological record. Because here is the thing. If you wanted to identify the signature of a catastrophic surface event that reshaped large portions of the Earth's terrain, you would look for certain features. You would look for sudden, dramatic changes in surface topology over short geological time periods. You would look for flat horizontal surfaces at elevation that could not be fully explained by gradual erosion. You would look for columnar fracturing patterns that suggest rapid, powerful thermal stress, the kind that could be produced not just by slow cooling magma, but by sudden extreme heating and cooling of surface rock. You would look for widespread absence of expected debris fields. You would look for a global distribution of similar structural features in geologically unrelated zones. And you would look for a cultural memory, distributed across multiple unconnected civilizations, describing a period of catastrophic terrestrial change: fire from the sky, the earth shaking, mountains rising, the sun behaving abnormally, a flood of extraordinary magnitude. Every one of these criteria is met. Not in one location. Not in one culture. Not in one geological period. Globally. The work of several researchers operating at the edge of accepted geological and archaeological discourse has drawn attention to what they describe as a worldwide pattern of reformed terrain. Among the most compelling is the work done around what some researchers call the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, a proposal published in peer-reviewed journals beginning in 2007 and expanded substantially in subsequent years, that approximately 12,900 years ago, at the beginning of the Younger Dryas cooling period, the Earth experienced an impact or airburst event, possibly a fragmenting comet that triggered widespread fires, caused the extinction of large Pleistocene megafauna, contributed to the collapse of the Clovis culture in North America, and deposited a distinctive layer of impact markers, nanodiamonds, spherules, platinum concentrations found at sites across 4 continents. This hypothesis is contested. It is not fringe. It has been published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. It has been supported and challenged by multiple independent research teams. The debate continues. But notice what it implies for terrain. An airburst event of sufficient magnitude over a landmass does not leave a crater. It leaves a pressure wave and a thermal pulse of extraordinary power. It can level forests across thousands of square miles, as the 1908 Tunguska event demonstrated, at a small fraction of the scale being proposed for the Younger Dryas event. Now scale that up by several orders of magnitude. What does extreme thermal and pressure loading do to surface rock formations? It can shear them horizontally. It can fracture vertical faces cleanly. It can strip loose sedimentary material from harder igneous or metamorphic cores. It can, in short, produce formations that look exactly like what we find at Devil's Tower, at Roraima, at the Zhangjiajie columns, at the basalt plateaus of Iceland and the American West. This is not proof. But it is a pattern. And patterns demand explanation. Return for a moment to the flat summit. This detail is not given sufficient attention in conventional geological accounts, and that omission is worth examining. A formation that rises through erosion through the slow removal of surrounding material should not, in general, have a flat top. Erosion is not a horizontal process. Erosion attacks all exposed surfaces. A formation that has been standing above its surrounding terrain for millions of years, exposed to wind, rain, frost wedging, and chemical weathering, should show significant summit degradation. The summit of Devil's Tower is not perfectly flat in the manner of a machined surface. It is irregular, covered with rubble and vegetation, shaped by real weathering processes. But it is strikingly, anomalously horizontal for a formation of its type and age. The same observation applies to Roraima, where the quartzite summit plateau, one of the oldest exposed rock surfaces on Earth, dating to the Precambrian, maintains a horizontal crown despite billions of years of exposure. The same observation applies to the mesa formations of the American Southwest, where flat-topped buttes in Monument Valley maintain their horizontal geometry across distances of miles despite standing in one of the most erosionally active landscapes in North America. The same observation applies to the tepuis of Venezuela, to the ambas of Ethiopia, to the flat-topped volcanic islands of the North Atlantic. In each case, the accepted explanation involves selective erosion. The flat top is explained as the remnant of an original horizontal surface, usually a lava flow or a sedimentary stratum, that was simply more resistant than the surrounding material. This explanation works. But it requires that in every case, across every geological context, the original horizontal surface was preserved while everything around it was removed, a repeated coincidence of preservation that, when mapped globally, begins to strain the framework of coincidence. There is another category of formation that rarely appears in the same conversation as Devil's Tower, but should. The submarine plateaus. Beneath the world's oceans lie enormous flat-topped structures called guyots or table mounts that rise from the seafloor to elevations that once, in some cases, reached or approached the surface. These flat-topped underwater mountains were first identified by Harry Hess during World War II, when naval sonar mapping revealed thousands of them distributed across the Pacific Ocean floor. The accepted explanation for guyots is elegant. They were once volcanic islands whose summits were planed flat by wave action at sea level. As the oceanic crust cooled and subsided, or as sea levels rose, these islands were submerged, preserving their flat-planed crowns at depth. This explanation is geologically sound. But the distribution pattern of guyots in the Pacific is extraordinary. There are thousands of them. They cluster in ways that suggest either an extraordinary period of volcanic island formation followed by systematic subsidence, or something else, an event that simultaneously affected sea level and surface topology across an entire ocean basin. The timing of Pacific geosubmergence, based on sediment analysis and the fossils of shallow water organisms found on their crowns, clusters in certain geological periods with uncomfortable frequency. Uncomfortable, because those periods overlap with known extinction events, climate disruptions, and the cultural memory horizon of flood myths distributed across Pacific Island peoples. Let's talk about the Giant's Causeway, because it represents a case where the official explanation is almost certainly correct, and yet even here, something about the official explanation leaves a residue of unresolved detail. The Giant's Causeway on the northeastern coast of Northern Ireland consists of approximately 40,000 interlocking basalt columns, mostly hexagonal, formed approximately 50 to 60 million years ago from a volcanic event associated with the opening of the North Atlantic Ocean. The science of its formation is well understood. And yet the precision of these columns that fit against each other with such regularity that you could mistake them for worked stone has generated human wonder since they were first described in detail in the 17th century. The Irish mythological tradition, of course, attributed them to the giant Finn mac Cool, who built a causeway across the sea to Scotland, where the same volcanic formation appears at Fingal's Cave on the Isle of Staffa. What the mythology captured before geology explained it was the recognition that the same structure appears on both sides of an ocean crossing. Two outcroppings of the same geological event, separated by 50 miles of open water. The volcanic system that produced both the Giant's Causeway and Fingal's Cave was part of the North Atlantic igneous province, the massive magmatic event associated with the rifting apart of North America and Europe. This is the point where geology becomes genuinely staggering in its implications, and it is a point the conventional narrative moves through too quickly. The Atlantic Ocean opened because a massive upwelling of mantle material forced the continents apart. This was not a slow, gentle process in geological terms. It was one of the most dramatic reshaping events in the last 100 million years of Earth's history. And it left behind, on both sides of the new ocean it created, the same columnar formations. The same geometric precision. The same flat-topped basalt surfaces. The columnar formations of the North Atlantic are the scar tissue of continental rupture. That is what we are standing on when we stand at the Giant's Causeway. Return to the global map. Overlay the locations of major columnar formation sites worldwide. Overlay the locations of major flood basalt provinces. Overlay the locations of major impact structures, verified asteroid and comet impact sites. Overlay the distribution of Younger Dryas impact markers. Overlay the distribution of global flood traditions in ancient and indigenous cultures. The overlaps are not perfect. No pattern this scale would be. But the convergence zones, the areas where multiple categories of anomaly cluster, are not randomly distributed. They trace something. Whether that something is a sequence of major impact events across geological time, a single catastrophic episode within or near human memory, or a deeper pattern in the behavior of the planet's magmatic and tectonic systems, cannot be determined from this evidence alone. But the pattern is there. And the pattern has not been explained. Not fully. Not in a way that accounts for all the data simultaneously. Here is what the suppression argument looks like, and it needs to be stated carefully, because the word suppression implies an active conspiracy, and what we are describing is something more structural and perhaps more insidious than a conspiracy. It is not that geologists have hidden evidence. It is that the scientific community, like all communities, has a consensus framework, a paradigm, in the Kuhnian sense, and within that paradigm, certain questions are not asked because they do not fit the categories the paradigm recognizes. No one suppressed the Guyot data. Harry Hess published it. No one suppressed the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. It appeared in major peer-reviewed journals. No one suppressed the tepuis geology. It has been studied for over a century. What has not happened is the synthesis. The step back. The willingness to look at all of these formations, the towers, the flat peaks, the guyots, the basalt columns, the mesa formations, the tepuis, as parts of a single question rather than separate geological curiosities. That synthesis has not been suppressed. It has simply not been funded, not been institutionally supported, not been given a journal home or a professional framework, because it crosses too many disciplinary boundaries and challenges too many settled explanations simultaneously. The paradigm does not suppress the evidence. It simply has no category for what the evidence, taken together, might mean. In the 1990s, a geologist named Robert Schoch, known primarily for his controversial redating of the Great Sphinx of Giza based on weathering patterns, began examining what he called punctuated catastrophism, the hypothesis that Earth's history has been shaped not only by slow, gradual processes but by sudden, catastrophic episodes of global reshaping that fall outside the timeline of recorded human history but within the reach of human cultural memory. Schoch's work on the Sphinx, whatever one thinks of its conclusions, demonstrated something methodologically important, that geological weathering analysis can challenge archaeological and historical timelines that were established on non-geological grounds. The same methodology, applied to the flat-top formations globally, raises uncomfortable questions about their dating. When we say Devil's Tower was exposed by erosion over the last 50 million years, that timeline is inferred from regional geological history, from radiometric dating of the rock itself, and from sedimentary analysis of surrounding formations. But the rate of erosion, the speed at which the surrounding material was removed, is an estimate. An estimate based on the assumed continuity of present erosional processes into the past. If those erosional processes were interrupted dramatically, catastrophically, globally by events that removed vast quantities of surface material rapidly rather than gradually, then the timeline of exposure would be wrong. Not necessarily wrong in the age of the rock, but wrong in the timing of the exposure. And if these formations were exposed more recently than the conventional timeline suggests, if they emerged from surrounding terrain not over millions of years but over thousands, then the indigenous cultural memories associated with them are not mythology. They are eyewitness testimony. The Kiowa tradition says the tower rose. The Lakota tradition says the tower bears the marks of the bear's assault, that the columns are scratches left by claws. Geologists say the columns formed as the magma cooled underground. These two accounts are not necessarily incompatible. What if the columns formed underground as geology says, and then the formation was rapidly exposed as the indigenous traditions suggest within human memory? What if the story of the bear and the children and the rising rock is a cultural encoding of an actual geological event, an episode of rapid erosion or terrain reshaping that exposed this formation within the memory of people who were there to witness it? This is not pseudoscience. This is the kind of question that archaeogeology, the intersection of archaeological cultural evidence and geological process, exists to ask. It is simply not asking it. There is a name that appears in the margins of this investigation, in the work of researchers who study what they call the electric universe hypothesis, a deeply controversial but scientifically literate framework that proposes the primacy of electromagnetic forces in shaping planetary surfaces. The EU hypothesis, developed principally by engineers and physicists rather than geologists, proposes that many surface features currently attributed to erosion, volcanism, or impact, including mesas, buttes, tower formations, and basalt column structures, were formed by large-scale electrical discharge events between the Earth and other bodies in the early solar system. This hypothesis is not accepted by mainstream science. It conflicts with established physics in several fundamental ways. Most mainstream physicists regard it as fundamentally flawed. But it is worth noting that the features the EU hypothesis attempts to explain, the flat tops, the vertical walls, the columnar structures, the absence of expected debris fields, are precisely the features that the conventional model also struggles to fully explain. The EU framework is almost certainly wrong in its proposed mechanism. But the anomalies it identifies are real. And anomalies that generate multiple competing non-mainstream explanations are almost always anomalies that the mainstream explanation has not fully resolved. Let's go back to Devil's Tower one final time. Stand at its base. Look up. The columns rise above you in interlocking vertical sheaves, some leaning slightly, some perfectly plumb, their surfaces weathered to a pale gray that catches the light differently at every hour of the day. At the summit 867 feet above where you stand, a flat crown of broken rock and sparse vegetation sits in the Wyoming sky like a table set for no one. Around you, the Belle Fourche River Valley spreads in every direction. Farmland. Grassland. The ordinary American West. And this thing rises from it. Not gradually. Not in the way a hill rises, or a ridge, or even a conventional mountain. It simply ends the landscape in a vertical wall and then is replaced by sky. Henry Newton, standing at this same spot in 1875, wrote that he could not explain it. 150 years of geological science has provided an explanation. That explanation covers the composition of the rock, the mechanism of the columns, the general process of erosional exposure. It does not fully explain the summit geometry. It does not explain the volume problem. It does not explain the global pattern. It does not explain the convergence of indigenous traditions describing emergence and rupture. It does not explain why, on every continent, in every geological zone, the same basic structure appears: the flat top, the vertical wall, the columnar precision with a frequency that exceeds what random erosional processes operating independently across millions of years should produce. The pattern exists. That is the only conclusion this investigation can deliver with certainty. The pattern of flat peaks, of tower formations, of columnar summits distributed across the planet's surface, in geological contexts ranging from ancient Precambrian shields to relatively recent volcanic events, is real, measurable, and documented. The question of what produced that pattern, whether it was the slow accumulation of independently operating geological processes, or whether it reflects something more unified, more catastrophic, and potentially more recent, remains open. Not because the evidence is insufficient, but because no one has fully asked the question in a framework broad enough to hold all the evidence at once. Science advances in disciplines. This question lives between disciplines, between geology and archaeology, between climatology and cultural anthropology, between impact science and oral history. And questions that live between disciplines tend to wait. They wait until someone builds a framework large enough to hold them. In 1906, Theodore Roosevelt designated Devil's Tower as the first national monument in the United States. In his proclamation, he described it as an extraordinary example of the handiwork of nature. Handiwork. It is an interesting word for a president to use. Handiwork implies craft. It implies intention. It implies a maker who shaped the material to a purpose. Roosevelt almost certainly meant it figuratively. But standing at the base of this tower, looking at the geometric perfection of its columns, looking at the improbable flatness of its crown, looking at the distribution of similar structures across every continent on this planet, it is difficult not to feel that the word he chose was more accurate than he knew. Not because something made these towers, but because nature, at sufficient scale, under sufficient violence, can produce results so ordered, so geometric, so architecturally precise, that the distinction between handiwork and natural process begins to blur. And the question of what kind of force, what scale of event, what speed of reshaping could produce this pattern globally, and leave behind cultural memories that echo across every civilization that has ever looked up at a flat peak and felt that something happened here. That question has not been answered. It has barely been asked. The towers are still standing. Their summits are still flat. The columns are still there, precise, geometric, repeating on 6 continents, in rock of every age and type, from formations that geologists date to the Precambrian to formations that emerged within the last few million years. And at their bases, on every continent, the people who lived near them looked up and told stories about the day the earth changed. Those stories are still there too, waiting for someone to take them as seriously as the rock. If this investigation has opened a question you've never been asked before, stay with it. The questions no one is asking are usually the ones most worth asking. More buried histories are waiting.